Alright, here's a question that's probably started more arguments in restaurants than almost anything else on the menu. How do you want your steak cooked? And right behind that, the one that really exposes everything. Why do so many people feel this weird pressure to say medium rare, like it's some kind of law? Like there's actually a correct answer? Here's the thing, there isn't. And once you really get why, you're gonna look at every steak menu completely differently. We're gonna go through 10 steaks today, but this isn't just a list. Every single one starts with a question that actually matters. Let's get into it. Section 1, Ribeye. Alright, let's start with the king of steaks, ribeye. Here's the question everybody gets completely wrong. Why is ribeye actually considered the best steak? Most people think it's because it tastes the most beefy. That's what I thought for years. But that's not it at all. Ribeye wins because of fat, and specifically, fat that runs through the muscle in those thin, white lines you've probably noticed. Marbling. These aren't just random fat deposits. They're threaded in between the muscle fibers themselves. So when you cook it, that fat melts and bastes the steak from the inside out. That's where the moisture comes from. That's where the richness comes from. That's the buttery texture everyone raves about. Now, ribeye comes from the rib section, 6th to 12th rib, right along the spine. These muscles basically just stand there. They don't do any real work. So the meat stays soft. But here's the thing, soft by itself isn't that impressive. Tenderloin's softer. What makes ribeye king is having both, soft muscle and all that marbling, tender and flavored at the same time. Now here's something most videos skip entirely. Aging, dry aging versus wet aging, and why it matters way more than the cut itself. Dry aging is when you hang a whole rib section or a big cut in a humidity-controlled cooler for 28 to 45 days. The outside dries out, you trim it off, and what you're left with is concentrated flavor. Enzymes in the meat break down the proteins, making everything more tender. The fat oxidizes slightly and develops this nutty, almost mushroomy complexity that just doesn't exist in fresh beef. Wet aging is simpler, vacuum sealed, and sitting in the fridge for the same amount of time. No moisture loss, no enzymatic breakdown. The beef stays basically fresh. It's still beef, but it's not transformed. The difference is night and day. A dry-aged ribeye tastes like a completely different product from a wet-aged one, even if they're the same cut and the same grade. The catch? Most restaurants, even pretty good ones, serve wet-aged beef. Why? Because dry aging means holding on to inventory for 30+ days, and you lose 15 to 30% of the weight to trim. That's expensive. So when you're paying premium prices at a regular steakhouse, most of what you're paying for is the marbling grade, not the aging process. But at the really good steakhouses, dry aging is part of the deal. And if you've never had a 45-day dry-aged prime ribeye, you haven't really had ribeye yet. One more thing on marbling. USDA prime hits around 8 to 10% intramuscular fat. A solid choice is more like 4 to 6. For reference, a chicken breast is about 3%. The jump from 4 to 10% fat doesn't sound huge on paper. In your mouth, it's the difference between a steak that tastes like something and one that tastes like butter and beef had a baby. Section 2, Tenderloin. Now here's where things get spicy. The tenderloin's the most tender cut on the whole animal. Nobody's arguing that. It sits under the spine, does basically nothing, and produces a muscle so soft you can cut it with a fork. Technically, it is the pinnacle of tenderness. So why do serious steak people call it overrated? Because tender's not the same as flavorful. Not even close. The tenderloin doesn't accumulate much of anything in terms of flavor compounds. It's lean. Like, really lean. Almost no fat, minimal connective tissue, not a lot of myoglobin. What you get is incredibly soft protein that basically tastes like protein. Compared to a well-marbled ribeye, tenderloin can honestly taste a little boring. And here's where the doneness question gets interesting. Because tenderloin's so lean, your choice of how to cook it is basically a value statement. Order it medium rare and you're actually tasting the subtle differences, the fat variation, the animal quality. Order it well done and you've basically spent premium money on something that tastes like expensive clouds with a steak price tag. Now here's a question nobody asks in restaurants. Who actually decided medium rare was the only correct way to eat steak? Medium rare became the cultural default in American fine dining sometime in the mid-1900s, partly because chefs noticed it hits the temperature where the Maillard crust forms while the center stays juicy. That's real chemistry, but it got elevated from a preference into a dogma, to the point where ordering a well-done filet mignon at a steakhouse is basically treated as a character flaw. Is that fair? Let's think about this honestly. Well-done beef loses more myoglobin, which means less of that iron-rich flavor that makes beef taste beefy. If you're cooking a prime ribeye to well done, you've destroyed most of what made it worth ordering in the first place. But a well-done tenderloin? It's already so lean that you're not losing much flavor to the heat, because there wasn't a ton of flavor there to begin with. The real question isn't whether medium rare is correct. It's whether your choice of doneness actually matches what you're eating. And that answer is different for every single cut. Section 3. New York Strip. The New York Strip is, without a doubt, the most misunderstood steak in America. It comes from the short loin, right behind the tenderloin's territory, but from a muscle that works way harder. Less tender, way more flavor. There's a strip of fat along one edge that renders down as it cooks, adding richness to every bite. And because it's leaner than ribeye, it actually sears better. The Maillard reaction hits harder on a drier surface, giving you that crust-to-center contrast that some steak people think is the whole reason to eat steak in the first place. Here's a question most diners never think to ask. Why do some steakhouses actually charge more for New York strip than ribeye? Sometimes it's aging. A dry-aged New York strip, well-marbled, can be more complex than a wet-aged prime ribeye. Aging is the great equalizer, and the strip's lower initial fat content means dry aging has more room to work with. The enzymatic breakdown creates depth that a younger piece of beef just can't touch. If you want the pure beef experience, nothing hidden, nothing added, New York strip at its best is arguably more interesting than ribeye. It's the difference between a symphony and a solo. Both hit different. One's just louder. Section 4. T-bone and Porterhouse. Now let's talk T-bone and Porterhouse. Same cut, technically. Completely different experience and practice. Both come from the short loin where the tenderloin meets the top loin. Both have that T-shaped bone. But the tenderloin side of a Porterhouse is way thicker because Porterhouse is cut from the wide end of the tenderloin, while T-bone comes from the narrower middle. Here's what that T-bone actually does, and most videos get this wrong. The bone acts as a heat differential. Bone marrow fat melts at a lower temperature than muscle fat and carries water-soluble flavor compounds that migrate into the surrounding meat as it cooks. That's real. There's actual science behind it. It's not just some old wives' tale. But here's the second thing nobody really discusses. The bone prevents the two muscles on either side from contracting unevenly during high-heat cooking. Muscles shrink perpendicular to their grain when they heat up. Two muscles of different densities next to each other want to shrink at completely different rates. The bone holds them in place and keeps everything cooking more evenly. Now, here's the doneness question that actually matters with bone-in steaks. Bone acts as a thermal insulator. Meat right next to the bone is always at a different temperature than meat farther away. This means bone-in steaks actually cook less evenly than boneless cuts of the same thickness. That's just physics. If you want perfect, uniform doneness from edge to center, bone's a liability. If you want the flavor benefits and structural evenness, it's an asset. There's no universally correct answer here, just what you prefer. Section 5. Filet mignon. Filet mignon is the most elegant steak in the world, and it is philosophically controversial in a way that splits food people pretty hard. The name's French for cute filet, referring to the small, thick, perfectly cylindrical shape cut from the narrow tip of the tenderloin. That shape isn't accidental. It cooks evenly, plates beautifully, and slices into pristine medallions. In a beef Wellington, it's the only thing that makes sense. But here's the question that splits food writers. Is elegance the same thing as quality? Most serious steak people say no. Filet mignon has the texture of really expensive tofu, soft, yielding, practically melts. But it lacks the fat, the iron, the depth that makes beef actually taste like beef. You pay for tenderness and you get it. But you're often paying premium prices for something that needs bacon wrapped around it, or butter sauce on top, or peppercorn everything, to taste like anything memorable at all. The defense: not everyone wants a steak that fights back. Sometimes refinement is the point, not intensity. This isn't wrong. It's a different value system. Both sides are right, which is why it stays on every serious steakhouse menu, and why it'll never be the most popular choice. Section 6. Tomahawk. The tomahawk is basically Instagram royalty. It's a ribeye with the entire rib bone left intact, trimmed down to create this 8-inch handle, making the whole thing look like, well, a tomahawk axe. It's almost entirely theater. The bone adds a tiny bit of flavor migration during cooking, real, but barely noticeable. What you're really paying for is the visual spectacle, and restaurants know it. Tomahawks often cost twice as much as an equivalent weight ribeye, purely because people will pay for the experience of ordering it. Here's the uncomfortable truth most chefs won't tell you directly. The tomahawk's not actually the best way to eat ribeye. That long bone makes even cooking really difficult. The meat near the bone handle end is usually overcooked by the time the thick center reaches temperature. A thick ribeye on a cast iron, no bone, will beat it almost every time in terms of actual eating quality. The tomahawk's for people who want the experience of ordering a tomahawk. And that's valid. Just be honest with yourself about which experience you're actually buying. Section 7. Flat iron. In 2009, researchers at the University of Nebraska were studying chuck muscles, the shoulder area, which does a ton of work and normally ends up as ground beef or stew meat. Nothing valuable. But in the top blade muscle, they found something unexpected: a thin ribbon of meat running through the center that was seriously tender. Almost as tender as the tenderloin itself. Not because of low use. This muscle was working harder than almost anything else. Something about the specific way those fibers were arranged created softness despite the environment. They called it the flat iron, and it kind of broke the steak industry. Here's what most people don't know. The FDA reclassified it as a whole muscle in 2010, which meant it could finally be sold as steak instead of chuck. It was bypassing a classification system that had kept it in the commodity beef category for decades, based on historical precedent rather than anything intrinsic to the meat itself. A solid flat iron from a good butcher, maybe $12 a pound, can genuinely be a better eating experience than a $40 commodity ribeye from a grocery store. The tenderness comes from geometry, not marbling, not aging, not fancy genetics. Just the way the fibers are built. The best steak value in America sits in the chuck section. Now you know where to look. Section 8. Skirt steak. Ask a professional butcher what the most flavorful steak they sell is, and a lot of them will say skirt. Skirt steak comes from the diaphragm muscles that work constantly, every single breath the animal takes. This is one of the hardest work parts of the whole cow. And hard work means flavor. Dense, iron-rich, beefy intensity that makes ribeye taste mild by comparison. It also means serious chew. Skirt steak is not tender, not even a little. The secret is cutting against the grain, which shortens the muscle fibers so they separate instead of pulling against each other when you bite. Get this right, and the chew becomes totally manageable. Get it wrong, and you're chewing for 5 minutes on end. The shape is long and flat, about 2 feet. Perfect for a cast iron on really high heat, or over an open flame. This is why skirt steak's the foundation of Mexican fajitas, Brazilian churrasco, Chinese chuan, all cuisines that independently figured out that skirt steak over serious heat creates something pretty extraordinary. Most home cooks give up on skirt steak because they treat it like a ribeye. Thick cut, medium heat, expecting softness. It fails every time. But for people who know what they're doing, skirt steak delivers more beef flavor per dollar than almost anything in the case. The real question isn't how skirt steak compares to ribeye. It's whether you know how to cook it. Ignorance has a price. Knowledge is free. Section 9. Wagyu. Alright, now we get to the world's most hyped and most genuinely contested beef. Wagyu means Japanese cow, for breeds originally developed in Japan for agricultural work. What makes Wagyu unique is a breeding philosophy refined over centuries. Animals selected not for yield or growth rate, but for their ability to deposit fat within muscle tissue at ridiculous levels, marbling far beyond anything you find in Western beef. Regular USDA prime hits about 8 to 10% intramuscular fat. Japanese A5 Wagyu can exceed 50%. An A5 Wagyu ribeye literally melts at body temperature. The fat's so finely distributed throughout the muscle that eating it feels less like steak and more like a really intense piece of buttery fish. Here's where the food world splits. Serious beef people who prize depth of flavor, iron richness, the savory punch of a great dry-aged ribeye. A lot of them think A5 Wagyu is actually kind of boring. The fat overwhelms everything. The experience is all richness and basically no beef flavor. It's delicious, sure, but is it actually steak? The counter-argument: Wagyu isn't trying to be beef-flavored beef. It's a luxury item closer to foie gras. Judging it by the same standards is missing the point entirely. There's also a less discussed problem nobody talks about. Most Wagyu sold outside Japan isn't actually Japanese Wagyu. American Wagyu is often crossbred, maybe 25 to 50% actual Wagyu genetics, raised in completely different conditions, then sold at premiums that have almost nothing to do with true A5 quality. And even within Japan itself, there's another split. Kobe beef is a specific Wagyu breed from Hyogo Prefecture, raised under extremely specific conditions. Kobe is to Wagyu what champagne is to sparkling wine. Using those terms interchangeably is technically wrong. True A5 Japanese Wagyu at a high-end restaurant might run you $300 to $500 per serving. American Wagyu at a mid-range steakhouse is often $60 and gives you something closer to high-quality USDA prime. The gap between those two is enormous, in both price and actual product. The world's best steak doesn't have a clean answer, and the people who claim it does are usually selling something. Section 10. Flank steak. Flank steak is the best steak most people have never actually heard of. It comes from the abdominal muscles, heavily worked, intensely flavored. Unlike skirt steak, flank is one broad flat cut, about an inch thick and a foot long. More surface area means more crust. Easier to cook than skirt, almost as flavorful. The technique's the same as skirt. High heat, fast sear, slice against the grain. Flank has a more open grain structure, slightly more substantial bite, more fiber pull, but the principle's identical. Here's the insider knowledge. Flank steak is where steakhouses send you when you order London broil. London broil isn't a cut, it's a cooking method. You take flank or skirt, marinate it, sear it hard, slice it thin. What you get is a completely different product from a conventional steak, designed for a different kind of hunger. Flank also makes the world's best carne asada. Not an accident. The open muscle fibers absorb marinade deeply. Lime, cilantro, garlic, oil, filling the interior with brightness that cuts against the beef's iron depth. The result is one of the great beef experiences on the planet. This is a steak for people who actually know beef. And now you're one of them. So, back to where we started. How do you want your steak cooked? And the real question underneath that, is there actually a correct answer? After going through 10 steaks, the honest conclusion is this. Doneness is a conversation between the cut, the aging, and your own palate. Not a universal law handed down from on high. Medium rare is not the correct answer. It's the currently fashionable one. And those are completely different things. The best steak experience comes from knowing what you're actually eating. Understanding why a dry-aged ribeye tastes different from wet-aged, why bone-in cooks differently from boneless, why A5 Wagyu and USDA Prime are genuinely different products being unfairly compared to each other. Knowledge changes what you taste. Now you've got more of it. Next time you look at a steak menu, ask the questions we asked today. Not, what's the most expensive, but what am I actually hungry for? Because the best steak isn't the one on the menu. It's the one that matches what you're actually craving.